A black CEO started bleeding from his mouth after drinking special coffee. The flight attendant smirked. Whoops, wrong mug. What happens next will leave you speechless. They tried to poison his peace, but he refused to be silenced. Subscribe if you believe in exposing every act of cruelty and racism. The mug landed with a soft clink. Damon Carver glanced up from his tablet as the tray table before him trembled slightly. A tall flight attendant with neatly combed blonde hair and an expression too rigid to be polite placed a coffee cup down without a word. Damon noticed immediately it wasn't the standard ceramic tumbler with the airline's silver crest that every other passenger in first class had been served. His was plain, dark green, dull against the stainless tray. No insignia, no coaster, just a single napkin tucked underneath, folded once. Coffee, the man muttered, not looking him in the eye. Thank you, Damon said, voice calm though his brow furrowed slightly. The flight attendant turned on his heel and walked away, his posture too stiff for it to be anything but intentional. Damon's eyes followed him for a moment, then drifted to the coffee. He picked it up cautiously, feeling the warmth through the ceramic. It smelled different. Earthy, but sharp, bitterer than usual. Maybe it was just the late hour or his nerves. Still, something tugged at the edge of his instincts, an unease he couldn't shake. He leaned back in his leather seat, adjusting the seatbelt over his navy blazer. The cabin around him buzzed in quiet luxury. Hushed voices, soft overhead lights, the gentle hum of the engines. Most of the passengers had already reclined, some flipping through glossy magazines, others watching muted screens. Damon had boarded discreetly, declining the offer of an escort through the private terminal. He preferred solitude on nights like this. Focus, reflection. No noise, no distractions. But something felt off. From the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin, eyes had lingered on him just a second too long. Not curious glances, no. These were different. Weighted. Calculating. Damon had spent his life learning to read those looks. He knew the difference between admiration and suspicion, between acknowledgement and judgment. And Jarrett Boone, the flight attendant assigned to his aisle, had made that judgment loud and clear without uttering a single word. Earlier, when Damon had requested a cup of coffee before takeoff, Boone's expression didn't change. Just a curt nod and a disappearance into the galley. Other passengers were served with practiced charm, glasses of champagne, warm towels, complimentary sweets. Boone smiled at them, made jokes, adjusted pillows, but for Damon, nothing. Not even eye contact. Not even a basic "sir." He took a cautious sip of the coffee. It burned more than expected, not in temperature but in taste. The bitterness clung to his tongue, oddly metallic. Damon swallowed, barely masking the wince. He set the cup down slowly. His gaze moved again to the other passengers. A middle-aged man 2 rows down stirred cream into his standard-issue mug, chatting with a younger associate. Across the aisle, an elderly gentleman thumbed through a leather-bound book, his drink untouched but steaming in the air. Damon touched his bottom lip absently, then pulled back his hand. Red. Bright and sudden. He blinked, stunned. He reached for the napkin beneath the cup and dabbed at his mouth. More red. His breath quickened just slightly. No panic, not yet, but alarm. He pressed the napkin gently, then folded it over. A small gash, likely on the inside of his lip. Maybe a cracked tooth? Number. He would have felt that. He hadn't bitten anything. Just coffee. "Excuse me," he called out, keeping his voice even. Boone turned from the galley but didn't approach. "Yes?" Damon held up the napkin. "I think something's wrong with the coffee." Boone raised an eyebrow, walked over slowly, and looked down at the bloodied cloth with exaggerated concern. "Oh," he said lightly. "Whoops, wrong mug." The words landed like a slap, coated in mock sympathy. Boone's mouth curled, not in a smile, but something colder. Smug. Calculated. Damon stared at him, the tension between them stretching like a taut wire. Boone turned and walked away again, leaving Damon with the bitter taste still lingering and a tightening knot in his chest. Several nearby passengers glanced over, then looked away. No one spoke. No one asked if he was all right. Damon took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his mind. Was it just an accident? Was he overreacting? But Boone's words hadn't sounded like a mistake. They sounded like a choice. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with steady precision as he navigated to the voice recording app. With a flick of his thumb, he pressed record and slipped the device under his tray table, screen down. He leaned back, eyes half closed, pretending to rest. But inside, his mind moved quickly, scanning every detail, every glance, every shift in Boone's posture. He wasn't just a CEO on his way to a summit anymore. Something had shifted. This wasn't about coffee. It wasn't even about service. It was something else. Something darker. He didn't know it yet, but this flight would change everything. Jarrett returned with a small silver tray, his polished shoes making soft thuds against the plush carpet of the first-class aisle. Without a word, he placed a coffee mug in front of Damon Carver. Damon blinked, noticing it instantly. His was the only mug that didn't match the others. Every other passenger had been served in elegant white tumblers etched with the airline's crest, but his cup was dark green, unbranded, and looked oddly worn. Jarrett offered no explanation, only muttering under his breath with a smirk, "Special brew, just for you." Damon lifted the mug slowly, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. His fingers curled around the ceramic and he raised it to his lips. The aroma wasn't inviting. It was sharp, biting, like rust and stale grounds masked beneath artificial sweetness. Still, he took a cautious sip, and the taste hit him like a jolt. Bitter, metallic, almost sour at the edges. He paused, instinctively swishing the liquid in his mouth to test it again, trying to place the harsh flavor. Then it happened. A sharp sting shot through the inside of his mouth. He sucked in a breath and instinctively pressed his napkin against his lips. When he pulled it back, the white fabric was blotched with bright, unmistakable red. Blood. Damon stiffened in his seat. Pain flared in his gums and lower lip, sharp and raw. He reached for another napkin and pressed it gently along the inner edge of his mouth, trying to calm the ache and stop the bleeding. Trying to maintain composure, Damon looked up and gestured to Jarrett, who was now laughing softly with another passenger a few seats away. The flight attendant turned his head at Damon's silent call and strolled back over, all casual poise and rehearsed charm. Damon, holding the blood-stained napkin in one hand and the strange mug in the other, met him with a level gaze. "There's something wrong with this," Damon said, voice low but steady. Jarrett glanced at the napkin, then at the mug, then back to Damon. He leaned in slightly, the corners of his lips twitching with mock concern. "Whoops," he said with an airy chuckle. "Wrong mug." The words landed like a slap. Damon's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, wrong mug?" But Jarrett didn't answer. He turned on his heel, already walking away as if the conversation didn't matter. Damon stared at the back of the man's head, fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. Around him, a few passengers peeked over their seats, sensing something was off. But no one said a word. No one asked if he was okay. The silence was deafening. Above them, the captain's voice came through the intercom, smooth and practiced, announcing they had reached cruising altitude. Damon barely registered the words. He sat back slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, his tongue gingerly pressing against the tender wound inside his mouth. This wasn't just poor service or a casual mistake, it was deliberate. The timing, the mug, the smirk, it all pointed to something darker. His instincts flared like a fire alarm. As CEO of Viridian Corps, Damon had faced countless boardrooms, pressure-packed negotiations, and backroom politics, but nothing quite like this. He wasn't just a passenger on a plane, he was a target. But why? And more importantly, by who? He glanced discreetly at the seat pocket in front of him, then reached down into his jacket. Beneath the lining was his personal phone, one that wasn't synced with corporate servers. He powered it on and slid it into the inner pocket of his blazer, angling the camera lens just enough to peek above the edge of his lapel. With one smooth tap, he hit record. The small red light blinked silently in his jacket as he leaned back, feigning calm. He adjusted his posture, crossing one leg over the other, and returned the bloodied napkin to the tray. His fingers curled tightly around the armrest, knuckles pale. Every movement was now deliberate, every breath measured. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting long shadows across the aisle. Outside, clouds rolled by like silent ghosts. Damon's mind raced. If Jarrett had been bold enough to hand him something unsafe in plain view, what else was happening behind the scenes? Was this a one-time act of cruelty or part of something wider? Across the aisle, a man shifted in his seat, pulling a blanket over his legs. The hum of the engine filled the quiet cabin. And yet, Damon felt the noise in his bones like a warning. He dabbed the corner of his mouth again. The bleeding had slowed, but the sting remained. There was no medical kit offered, no apology given, no concern shown. Only that smile. That cold, rehearsed, and chilling smile. Damon's phone captured every frame, every word, every flicker of expression. He didn't know who would see this footage yet, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't let it disappear into silence. Not this time. He glanced at the other mugs on passengers' trays, white, clean, identical, then back at his own. Dark green, isolated, like a mark, a choice. Special brew, just for you. He heard the words echo again in his mind, like a threat wrapped in a joke. His lip throbbed as he swallowed the taste of metal. Something told him this wasn't just bad service, it was personal. Damon pressed the napkin firmly against his mouth, feeling the sharp sting of torn flesh beneath his lip. The taste of copper lingered, stronger now, cutting through the bitter aftertaste of whatever had been in that mug. Blood soaked into the napkin's folds, a vivid red smearing across its white surface. He blinked at the stain, then glanced around the cabin. Most of the other passengers were relaxed, reading, dozing, sipping their coffee from the pristine white mugs bearing the airline's gold insignia. His, he now noticed, had been a dull, dark green. No crest, no shine, just a ceramic lie. Without a word, Damon unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He kept his posture even, calm. Too many eyes could turn curious if they sensed a problem. The quiet hiss of the cabin doors and hum of the engines filled the silence around him as he walked to the restroom. Once inside the cramped space, he shut the door and flicked on the harsh overhead light. The mirror above the sink reflected a face he barely recognized. Tense, jaw clenched, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth. He leaned closer, parting his lips. The inside of his lower lip had a clean, narrow cut, as if something acidic or abrasive had traced the curve. It was shallow, but raw. The metallic taste hadn't faded, and Damon's instincts screamed that this wasn't just a strong brew. Something had been in that mug. He splashed water into the sink, cupped it in his hand, and gently rinsed his mouth. Pain flared again, confirming what he already feared. This wasn't from biting his tongue or a cracked cup. This had been deliberate. A slow anger simmered in his chest, but he kept it buried beneath layers of discipline. He couldn't afford a scandal, not now, not with the summit hours away, but neither could he ignore the possibility that he had been poisoned. Damon wiped his face dry, inhaled, and opened the door. As he stepped into the aisle, low voices drifted from the galley just ahead. The curtain separating first class from the service area had been left slightly ajar. Damon paused, angled slightly to appear as though he were simply adjusting his collar, and listened. "You really gave it to him?" said a voice, young, curious, half amused. "He's lucky I didn't switch the full batch," Jarrett replied, a smirk in his tone. Damon's breath caught. His muscles locked. His heart pounded not from fear, but from confirmation. His suspicion had been right. This wasn't a mistake or neglect. It was targeted, intentional. He moved quickly back to his seat, his face impassive, but his mind spinning. He eased into the cushion, buckled in, and reached down beneath the tray table. From inside his jacket pocket he retrieved his phone and, with careful fingers, opened the recording app. He hadn't captured the entire exchange, but the phone had been recording for the past few minutes since his discomfort began. Damon played it back under the quiet rattle of the beverage cart further up the aisle. Muffled, distant, but unmistakable, Jarrett's voice. "He's lucky I didn't switch the full batch." Damon's pulse surged. That single sentence was damning enough to prove motive. He kept the phone hidden under the tray table, his screen dimmed. His thoughts turned quickly toward documentation, evidence, and survival. Someone on this plane had tried to hurt him, and might not be done yet. As he adjusted the brightness of the screen and rewound the clip to double-check the audio quality, a hand gently touched his elbow. He turned. His seatmate, the quiet older man who had remained mostly silent since boarding, leaned in slightly. His voice was low but steady. "I saw him swap your cup." Damon stared at him. The man's face was lined, his eyes tired but focused, holding no trace of malice or exaggeration. "You saw?" Damon asked, whispering. The man nodded. "I didn't want to cause a scene. Wasn't sure at first, but I saw Jarrett take one mug off the cart, then switch it for the green one before walking over to you." Damon's heart raced again, but this time not just from alarm. This changed everything. If someone else witnessed it, then he wasn't imagining things. Wasn't alone in this. "What's your name?" Damon asked. "Lionel Drax," the man said simply. "I've worked in airline maintenance for over 20 years. I know what a swap looks like." Damon nodded, processing the weight of this revelation. A maintenance employee seated beside him, quietly watching, with no reason to lie. No reason to insert himself, unless the truth needed a second witness. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Damon asked. Lionel hesitated. He looked ahead, then down the aisle toward the galley where Jarrett now laughed with another crew member. "Because I've seen worse," Lionel murmured, "and because sometimes saying something too soon makes you disappear too fast. But now, I figured you should know." Damon looked at the man beside him, weathered hands, eyes that had seen too much, a quiet gravity to his presence. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," Damon said. His voice was low but sincere. Lionel gave the faintest of smiles, then turned his gaze forward once more, folding his arms. Damon sat back in his seat, the cabin lights dimming slightly as the aircraft settled into its mid-flight rhythm. He could feel the pain still throbbing in his lip, could still taste the metallic sting on his tongue. But now he had a witness, a recording, and the start of something deeper than a single act of cruelty. He glanced at Jarrett, who now moved smoothly through the cabin, offering drinks to others with practiced ease and empty charm. Damon's eyes narrowed. Whatever this man's game was, it wasn't over. But now, Damon wasn't playing alone. Now, he wasn't alone in this anymore. Damon's fingers curled tightly around the rim of his tray table as Lionel leaned in closer, the low hum of the cabin masking the weight of what he was about to reveal. The question had barely left Damon's mouth. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" when Lionel's expression shifted. A flicker of guilt crossed the older man's face, quickly replaced by resolve. "I work for the airline," Lionel said quietly, glancing left and right as though the overhead bins might be listening. "Internal maintenance, not repairs, surveillance. I've been investigating for months now." Damon's eyes narrowed. "Investigating what?" "Exactly what just happened to you," Lionel murmured, voice low but sharp. "Racial targeting, sabotage, crew misconduct. It's more common than they admit, especially on these longer flights. I board anonymously, rotate through different airlines. Today, I was supposed to observe, not intervene." Damon leaned back slightly, absorbing the words like a punch to the chest. "So, I was a case study to you?" Lionel shook his head. "Number you were a warning I ignored. But now—" He reached into the inside of his coat and pulled out what looked like a sleek black pen. With practiced precision, he twisted off the end, revealing a tiny metal chip embedded in the barrel. "This is what I've collected so far. Internal logs, footage, statements, some of it directly involving your flight attendant." Jarrett Boone. The name burned like acid in Damon's mind. He accepted the pen slowly, the weight of it far heavier than it looked. "Why are you giving this to me?" Lionel didn't hesitate. "Because you're already bleeding." The words cut deeper than the wound in Damon's mouth. He nodded once, firmly, and slipped the device into a hidden compartment inside his briefcase. Around them, the cabin lights dimmed to a gentle orange glow, signaling night mode. Most passengers reclined or dozed, unaware of the gravity unfolding in Seat 2B. Damon's thoughts ran wild. This wasn't just a matter of one cruel man with a grudge. This could be the thread that unraveled something far uglier. The coffee hadn't been a mistake. It had been a message. And now he had the beginnings of a counter-message. He pressed the call button. A moment later, a young trainee approached. Barely older than a college student, his uniform slightly wrinkled and hands fidgeting with the edge of his notepad. His name tag read Eli. Damon noted the nervous twitch in his eye, the slight tremble in his breath. "I'd like a sealed water bottle, please," Damon said, keeping his tone even. Eli nodded and stepped away, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the galley. Damon glanced sideways at Lionel, who kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his posture suddenly rigid. Within a minute, Eli returned. His hands shook slightly as he held out the bottle. "I'm sorry," he whispered, barely audible. "They told us to play along." Damon's eyes locked with his voice still calm but firm. "Who told you?" Eli's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but his eyes darted toward the back of the cabin. Then he turned and walked away briskly, disappearing into the corridor. Damon's pulse quickened. He unscrewed the water bottle slowly, not to drink, but to observe. It was clean, factory seal intact. Still, his grip tightened. The silence of the cabin felt heavier now, thick with unspoken tension. He stole a glance across the aisle, watching as Jarrett strolled down the row with practiced indifference, casually fluffing pillows and adjusting blankets. But every so often, his eyes flicked toward Damon's seat, brief, calculated, smug. It wasn't just hostility now, it was control, power, carefully cloaked in customer service. Damon reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved the green mug from earlier, now wrapped in a napkin. It still had traces of the bitter liquid inside. Maybe he could get it tested. Maybe it was already too late. He tucked it gently into a side pocket of his bag, determined not to leave it behind. "You think this goes deeper?" he asked, voice low, eyes still on Jarrett's figure in the aisle. Lionel nodded. "Way deeper. I've reviewed more than a dozen crew rosters. Jarrett's name pops up on every flagged flight. The same routes, the same type of passengers getting targeted." Damon exhaled slowly, absorbing the enormity of it. He wasn't just a target. He was a pattern. He opened his briefcase again and pulled out his laptop, placing it discreetly on the tray table. He inserted the pen drive at an angle, watching as a folder opened, a sea of files, all labeled with flight numbers and incident codes, internal memos, time-stamped videos, redacted crew chats, even internal customer complaint summaries that had never been acknowledged publicly. His stomach turned. The system wasn't just failing, it had been designed to. "Start documenting everything," Lionel said under his breath. "Names, times, what you tasted, who said what. If this goes to court, or the press, details will matter." Damon nodded. He pulled out a small notepad, began scribbling notes, his handwriting swift but legible. His mouth throbbed again, a reminder of the wound still fresh inside. He dabbed it with a fresh napkin and tasted the bitterness again. This time, it wasn't just from the coffee, it was from knowing how many times others had likely suffered the same fate in silence. The hum of the engines masked his racing thoughts, but one thing was clear. This was no longer about discomfort. This was about exposure. He leaned back for a moment, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. Then he opened them, stared forward, and whispered, "The mug was just the beginning of something much darker." Damon's tongue pressed instinctively against the roof of his mouth, but the motion brought a flash of pain. His lower lip throbbed, and the inside of his cheek had started to swell. What had first felt like a minor irritation was now a pulsing discomfort that refused to fade. He shifted in his seat, trying not to wince. The metallic taste that had lingered since the coffee had only deepened, like rust clinging to the edges of every breath. He pressed the button on his armrest to call for assistance. A different attendant, taller, middle-aged, with a thinning hairline, approached with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I need medical attention when we land," Damon said, his voice low but steady. "Something in the coffee caused a reaction. My mouth is swelling." The attendant's expression didn't change. He nodded once, briskly. "I'll notify the lead," he said, then walked away without asking a single follow-up question. There was no urgency in his step, no concern in his voice. Damon watched him speak briefly with Jarrett near the galley, the two exchanging a glance before both vanished behind the curtain. He exhaled slowly and turned toward Lionel, who had been keeping a discreet eye on the aisle. Damon could see it in the older man's furrowed brow and clenched jaw. He was just as unsettled. "They're going to downplay this," Damon murmured. "Bury it the moment we land." Lionel nodded grimly. "Unless you've got more than a napkin and a swollen lip, they'll say it was a sensitive mouth and move on. That's how they've done it before." Damon leaned forward and opened his laptop, heart pounding. He clicked into the folder labeled Contingency, Phase 1. Inside were the audio clip of Jarrett's remark, "He's lucky I didn't switch the full batch," and copies of the flash drive's contents, incident logs, crew rotation notes, and timestamps aligning Jarrett with multiple complaints from other flights. He didn't know yet if the files would be enough, but he had no time to second-guess. He began drafting a statement to his legal counsel, attaching the key materials, his fingers flying over the keys with surgical focus. Just as he hit the Wi-Fi button to initiate the send, a small pop echoed beneath the tray table. His laptop screen flickered once, then again, and then faded to black. Damon stared in disbelief. He pressed the power button. Nothing. No fans, no boot-up chime. Just silence. Across the aisle, a passenger stirred but said nothing. Lionel leaned in, eyes narrowed. "What happened?" They killed the Wi-Fi, Damon whispered, swallowing the surge of panic rising in his throat. Or worse, scrambled my machine. Not possible, Lionel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Damon looked toward the front of the cabin. Jarrett stood near the beverage cart, arms crossed, his weight leaning into the bulkhead like a man awaiting confirmation. His gaze met Damon's briefly, and in that moment, Jarrett smiled, just slightly. Cold, measured, empty. "They're watching our row," Lionel said, barely audible now. His voice trembled, not from fear, but realization. "They know you've got the files." Damon inhaled through his nose and reached down, slipping his hand beneath his pant leg, then into his shoe. He pulled out a small, flat black phone wrapped in a cloth sleeve, the emergency device, the one he never traveled without, not for browsing, not for calls, just pure data transfer with a pre-encrypted line to his trusted contact. With fingers steadier than he felt, he activated the phone's hotspot and tethered his own device to it. The screen blinked to life. Slowly, cautiously, Damon opened his file transfer app, loaded the encrypted folders, and selected a contact named Keon.M-SecureVault. The plane jolted slightly with turbulence, but Damon didn't move. Every muscle in his body was focused on the upload bar crawling across the screen. 30%. 40? 55. He glanced sideways. Jarrett hadn't moved, but now another attendant, a younger man with sharp cheekbones and a clipboard, stood just outside the curtain, pretending to check inventory. His eyes darted to Damon's screen and back again, watching, measuring. "Come on," Damon whispered to the phone. At 88%, the hotspot blinked red. "Connection unstable." Damon clenched his jaw. Number. Not now." Lionel leaned in, voice urgent. "They're cutting the signal again. You've got to hurry." Damon toggled his emergency network override. The hotspot re-engaged. 93, 97. A final beep. Transfer complete. He didn't breathe for 3 full seconds. And then a text arrived on the emergency line. "Keon Mays. Got it. Do not engage further. I'm calling ahead." Damon's shoulders sagged with relief, though the ache in his mouth had worsened. The pain pulsed along his jawline, each throb a cruel reminder of how close he had come to silence. He looked up at Jarrett, who now leaned against the service wall with the patience of someone certain of the outcome. The same hollow smile spread across his face. Damon stared right back, unflinching. Whatever was in that mug wasn't meant to hurt. It was meant to silence. The first jolt came not from the wheels hitting the runway, but from the flicker of Damon's emergency phone screen confirming, "Files sent successfully." Keon's reply appeared seconds later, a single phrase glowing in the dim light beneath Damon's tray table. "Got it. Do not engage further. I'm calling ahead." Damon exhaled, quietly but not in relief. It wasn't over. It had just begun. Outside his window, the city lights of Briar Hill crept closer, a soft mosaic of gold and steel below the clouds. Inside the cabin, tension simmered like static. The hum of the engine faded as the plane began its descent, but Damon's senses only heightened. Every shift in movement, every expression from the crew, struck him as suspicious. Jarrett Boone passed his row slowly, like a predator pacing a cage. His smirk was gone, not hidden, but transformed into something else. Composed. Waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Damon's instincts screamed that Jarrett knew something was about to happen. Beside him, Lionel sat still, jaw tight, fingers digging into the padded armrest. He leaned slightly toward Damon without turning his head. "I've seen catering records manipulated before," he whispered. "Temperature logs faked, items replaced, but they've never targeted a passenger like this. Not this openly." Damon nodded once, his mouth sore, his body heavy. The metallic tang still clung to his tongue like rust, and his lower lip throbbed with every breath. The pain reminded him that this wasn't a theory anymore. It was real, personal. The plane touched down with a smooth bounce, the landing gear hissing as it met the tarmac. A routine landing. Normal. But Damon's gut told him that what waited at the gate was anything but routine. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, he scanned the front of the cabin. No announcement from the captain. No "Welcome to Briar Hill." No word about medical personnel waiting. Just the sterile flicker of overhead lights and the rehearsed movements of flight attendants preparing for arrival. All of them wore the same expression, tight, unreadable, mechanical, and then he saw them. 2 men in plain clothes stood at the glass bridge jetway, positioned just outside the door before any other staff had begun to open it. Both wore dark jackets, one holding a clipboard, the other already pulling something from his inside pocket. Damon sat up straighter, heart rate quickening. He didn't recognize either man, but they moved with practiced confidence. Too sure. Too early. The jet bridge connected with a soft thunk. Cabin lights turned up. Jarrett remained by the galley, arms folded, his smirk now fully returned. His eyes locked with Damon's, as if silently saying, "Your stop has arrived." The door opened and the taller of the two men stepped inside. He had a shaved head, sunglasses tucked into his collar despite the hour, and a badge that flashed in his hand too quickly for Damon to read. "Mr. Carver," he said in a flat tone, "we need to speak with you about a disturbance on board." Damon didn't respond immediately. His fingers curled around the armrest. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "What kind of disturbance?" The second man stepped forward, blocking the aisle. "We'll explain outside the aircraft. It won't take long." Passengers had begun to unbuckle, collecting their bags, oblivious to the real drama unfolding in the first row. But Lionel rose suddenly, placing himself between Damon and the two men. "He's injured," Lionel said, his voice loud enough to draw a few curious looks. "He needs medical help, not questions." The taller man's tone sharpened. "Sir, step aside." He pressed a hand lightly but firmly against Lionel's chest. Damon could see the white of Lionel's knuckles as he resisted the urge to shove it away. Then, from behind the men, a new figure appeared. "I'd advise you to remove your hand," the voice said. All heads turned. Standing just beyond the threshold of the door was Keon Mays, calm but unflinching, a lanyard with legal credentials in one hand and a uniformed airport security officer at his side. A medic trailed behind them with a red bag slung over his shoulder. Keon stepped forward and addressed the plainclothes men. "I'm Damon Carver's legal representative. If you want to question him, you'll go through me first." The two men exchanged a glance. The taller one hesitated, then backed off slightly. "Just protocol," he muttered, slipping his badge into his coat and stepping aside. The uniformed officer nodded toward Damon. "Sir, if you'll come with us, we've arranged a quiet room nearby." Damon stood, wincing as a flash of pain shot through his mouth. He nodded in gratitude to Lionel, who exhaled with visible relief. The walk off the plane felt longer than any flight, every step measured, every eye in first class now glued to him. Once through the gate, the medic took his vitals quickly and quietly while Keon guided him into a reserved terminal room. The door closed with a muted thud, and silence fell. Keon's tablet glowed as he opened the files Damon had sent. He swiped through documents, photos, and the short audio clip Damon had recorded under the tray table. His jaw tightened as he read. "This isn't just a rogue flight attendant," Keon said, eyes scanning rapidly. "This is part of something systemic. Look at these incident logs. All buried or redirected. Someone's been cleaning up for Jarrett for years." Damon's hands clenched at his sides. He didn't speak, but the fire in his eyes said everything. Lionel, seated across from them now, pulled a crumpled sticky note from his pocket and handed it over. "That's the trainee's name, Eli Rohn. Young kid, barely through orientation, but he's seen too much already." Keon nodded. "We'll find him." Outside, the night wind howled against the windows. Inside, the truth had finally touched ground. The cracks were no longer hidden. This was no investigation. It was a cover-up already in motion. "Sir, we need you to come with us." The voice was low but firm. One of the plainclothes men stepped forward, gesturing for Damon to stand. The aisle was still crowded, passengers gathering their bags and murmuring softly as the seatbelt sign turned off with a chime. But the two men didn't wait for standard deplaning. They moved with quiet urgency, cutting off Damon's exit like guards moving a prisoner. Before Damon could speak, Lionel Drax rose from his seat beside him. His stance was calm, but his expression was steel. "He's injured," Lionel said flatly. "He needs medical help, not questions." The taller man among the two gave a faint, almost apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Step aside, sir. This won't take long." He placed a firm hand against Lionel's chest, pushing just slightly. Lionel didn't budge. The tension snapped. A second later, a voice rang out from the open cabin door. "That's far enough." All heads turned. Keon Mays entered the cabin like a lightning bolt. Sharp suit, polished badge holder in hand, eyes blazing with authority. Behind him stood a uniformed airport security officer and a male medic in a red jacket with a med kit slung over his shoulder. "I'm his legal representative," Keon declared, holding up his credentials. "You'll go through me first." For a heartbeat, the air itself felt still. The plainclothes agents exchanged a glance. The taller one exhaled and took a half step back, hands raised in false surrender. "Just trying to help him off quietly," he muttered. Keon didn't blink. "Not your job." The security officer moved forward then, speaking into his radio while signaling the two men to retreat toward the gate. Passengers began murmuring, watching the scene unfold with growing curiosity and unease. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Damon, still seated, finally stood, his legs slightly shaky beneath him. He nodded to Lionel in silent thanks and stepped into the aisle. He felt every eye on him. His mouth still throbbed with a dull ache, the metallic sting reminding him with every breath that this wasn't over. As he exited the plane, Keon guided him toward a nearby terminal room reserved for private debriefings. The medic walked beside them, occasionally checking Damon's pulse and gently examining the swelling in his lip. Once inside the room, Keon locked the door behind them and pulled out his tablet. "You okay to sit?" Damon nodded and lowered himself into the cushioned chair, exhaling as the pressure on his joints released. Keon dropped into the chair opposite him, immediately sliding the flash drive Lionel had given him into a portable port. The screen lit up with a flood of file names and time-stamped footage logs. "Let me guess," Damon said hoarsely. "This wasn't the first incident." Keon's eyes narrowed as he scrolled. Number not even close. He tapped on a folder labeled Boone Internal. Several internal complaint files opened, anonymous reports, crew memos, deleted passenger incident forms. One log showed a security footage snippet, Jarrett Boone rolling his eyes at a seated black passenger while pouring coffee over his tray table with what looked like deliberate force. Keon turned the screen so Damon could see. "This is part of something systemic," he said in a low, grim voice. "Look at these incident logs, all buried or redirected. Someone's been cleaning up for Jarrett for years." Damon felt his hands clench involuntarily. Rage curled hot in his chest, not just at Jarrett, but at the silence around him, the cover-up, the complicity. This was more than bias. This was protection. He leaned forward. "How deep does this go?" Keon shook his head. "Too early to say. But with this much smoke, there's a fire somewhere." The door opened with a soft knock and Lionel stepped inside, holding a folded piece of paper. He looked tired, but calm. "I figured you'd want this," he said, handing it to Keon. It was a torn section of the flight manifest with a name scribbled beside one of the lower-ranked crew slots, Eli Roan. Next to it, in smaller handwriting, were the words trainee, witnessed galley prep. Keon's brow lifted. "Who is he?" "Flight attendant in training," Lionel replied. "He's young, scared. But he saw what happened and whispered an apology to Damon mid-flight. He's the only one on that crew who didn't look dead behind the eyes." Damon took the manifest, eyes tracing the letters of Eli's name. This kid might hold the thread that unraveled everything. He looked up. "Do you think he'll talk?" Lionel hesitated, then nodded. "If we protect him, yes. He's already seen too much to forget." Keon leaned back, tapping a quick note into his phone. "We'll find him. Quietly." The medic returned, handing Damon an ice pack and a prescription card for an oral rinse. "You'll be fine, sir," he said gently, "but keep watch for any lingering numbness. Whatever was in that cup, it shouldn't have been there." As the door closed behind the medic, Keon turned the tablet toward Damon again, now paused on a frame of Jarrett smirking toward the camera on a different flight. "You ready for what comes next?" he asked. Damon didn't answer right away. He stared at the image on the screen, the same cold smile he'd seen at 30,000 feet, and felt something shift inside him. The anger wasn't boiling anymore. It was still, focused. "They think this ends with me," he murmured, "but I'm just the first crack." He turned to Lionel and offered a quiet nod. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. The walls were closing in, but the cracks had started to show. He drank the coffee meant to harm him, and they said, "Whoops, wrong mug. If you stand against hidden hate and silent attacks, hit subscribe now. This story needs to be told." The headline struck like a lightning bolt. CEO bleeds mid-flight after drinking special coffee. Whistleblower claims ongoing airline cover-up. The signal beacon, a relatively obscure but fiercely independent news outlet, published the story just before dawn. Within minutes, it had gone viral. The article included a snippet of Damon's onboard audio recording, Jarrett's voice, low and mocking, saying, "He's lucky I didn't switch the full batch." It was just enough to confirm suspicion, but not so much that it gave away all the evidence. Keon Mays had chosen the leak with precision. This wasn't just news, it was fire. By 6:30 a.m., Damon's name was trending across multiple platforms. The photo that accompanied the article showed him walking through the airport, jaw set, eyes calm but determined, with a small patch of dried blood at the corner of his mouth. The internet had seen worse, but this story struck a nerve. A black CEO, poisoned mid-flight, brushed off by airline staff and now backed by a whistleblower? It was too real to ignore. At Viridian Corps headquarters, the board convened an emergency video call. Most of them had woken up to the headline. Damon joined late, sitting in a quiet hotel room, a cold compress on his mouth and the lights dimmed to ease the throbbing in his jaw. They asked him what happened. He told them calmly, leaving no detail out. Some members looked horrified. Others were quiet. One man asked if it was wise to go public. Damon leaned forward. "Letting this go quietly would be the most dangerous mistake I could make," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "If it happened to me, it can happen to others. It probably already has." Meanwhile, the airline scrambled. They issued a press release by mid-morning, calling the incident an isolated misunderstanding and promising an internal review. The language was polished but evasive. Not once did it mention Damon by name. Not once did it acknowledge injury. It was, in every way, a corporate shield, thin, calculated, and dismissive. But Damon wasn't waiting for their narrative. By noon, Keon had arranged a small press conference in a conference room at a nearby hotel. Cameras were limited. Only vetted journalists were allowed in. No questions in advance, no spin. Damon arrived wearing a dark gray suit, a subtle lapel pin in the shape of a leaf, the emblem of Viridian Corps. He moved slowly, still sore, but with unmistakable purpose. The room quieted as he approached the podium. Lights flickered from camera crews, their whirring lenses catching every blink. Damon placed his notes on the stand but didn't look at them. "What happened to me wasn't a mistake," he began. His voice was low, clear, firm. It was a message. He paused, letting the silence settle in. Every face turned toward him, waiting. "But I have one, too," he said. "You can't poison silence when the truth already has a voice." The reporters scribbled furiously. A few exchanged glances, registering the impact of his words. The moment didn't need to be long, it just needed to be true. After the press conference, Damon returned to his room, exhausted. He slumped into the chair by the window, letting the soft breeze from the cracked pane brush against his face. Keon entered minutes later, tablet in hand, scrolling through reactions. "It's working," he said. "The story's everywhere. They can't ignore it now." But even as the headlines spread, the deeper layers of the truth began to surface. Lionel Drax, still in contact with Keon, revealed something that changed the tone of the entire situation. He had dug into employee records. Jarrett Boone, the flight attendant who had served Damon the tainted coffee, had family on the inside. His brother-in-law, Travis Wexley, held a senior position in the airline's Human Resources Department. Wexley had long been flagged in internal complaints as someone who quietly closed misconduct reports without proper investigation. Suddenly, the buried patterns made sense, the warnings unheeded, the accidental service errors, the reassignments instead of terminations. Keon looked up from the report, eyebrows tight with frustration. "They've been protecting him for years," he said. "This isn't just a personnel failure, it's a culture problem." Damon felt the anger swell in his chest again. Not the kind that made him reckless, but the kind that sharpened his vision. This wasn't about one mug. It was about the system that allowed men like Jarrett to operate unchecked. The smiles that hid contempt. The paperwork that buried truth. The policies that served as shields instead of protection. "Then it ends now," Damon said quietly. That evening, while bruises still dotted his gums and he could barely eat, Damon signed off on legal action. Keon filed a formal lawsuit on his behalf, supported by the whistleblower's statement and the forensic evidence from Lionel's chemical swab. The case wouldn't just be civil, it would demand regulatory review. Damon wanted federal oversight, industry exposure, and accountability from the top down. They had given him a mug to silence him. Now he was handing them a megaphone. Keon placed a call to a trusted contact in a major legal advocacy group. Meanwhile, Lionel sent over the name of the flight attendant trainee who had helped Damon, the one who had slipped him a sealed water bottle with shaking hands and an apology, Eli Roan. He was young, barely 2 years into the job, and already cracked by what he'd witnessed. But his cooperation had been vital. He might be the key to proving this was more than an accident, Lionel wrote. He's scared, but he's willing. As the sun dipped behind the city skyline, painting the windows in orange and gold, Damon stepped onto the hotel balcony. His lips were still sore, but the pain now felt like fuel. Below him, cars crawled through the city. Life moved on, unaware. But change, real change, was beginning. He raised the hotel room's ceramic mug to his lips. Water, not coffee, clean, pure, safe. And as the wind whispered around him, Damon thought back to what he had said earlier that day, words that echoed louder now than they had behind the podium. What happened to me wasn't a mistake. It was a message. But I have one, too. You can't poison silence when the truth already has a voice. The world had heard the mug crack, but now it was hearing the roar behind it. The offer came quietly, just 3 days after the press conference. A sealed envelope delivered by hand to Damon Carver's attorney's office marked confidential. Inside was a typed letter from the airline's legal counsel, offering a substantial settlement, enough money to make anyone walk away without questions. No admission of guilt, no public statement, just a generous check and a binding non-disclosure agreement. The message was clear. Accept, stay quiet, and let the world move on. Keon Mays read it twice, jaw clenched, then passed the letter across the long glass table to Damon, who sat in silence. The overhead lights in the boardroom hummed faintly, casting reflections against the chrome fixtures and Keon's tablet screen. Damon didn't blink. "They think this ends with a number," he said flatly, pushing the letter aside. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with purpose. "But it never started with one." Keon nodded, sliding the letter back into the envelope like it was radioactive. "Then we move forward." That afternoon, they filed the formal complaint in federal court, a lawsuit against the airline for negligence, willful endangerment, and discriminatory practices. Keon had spent the previous night assembling supporting evidence, now bolstered by the strongest asset yet, a signed affidavit from Eli Roan. Eli had submitted it quietly, using encrypted email and a secure identity verification process that Keon arranged through an independent legal network. The young trainee's statement was chilling. In it, he described an internal culture where certain crew members casually discussed flagging passengers for special treatment. More often than not, those passengers were high-profile black men or anyone seen as too self-important. There were coded terms, jokes shared in closed group chats, and the phrase that made Damon's blood run cold, "bitter brews for VIPs who act entitled." Keon stared at the printout of that line. "He actually wrote that," he muttered, turning the page to show Damon. The chat screenshot showed Jarrett's name clearly, beneath a grainy selfie of him holding a green mug. The evidence, though damning, wasn't enough alone. But Keon knew how to shift pressure. By evening, he had handed the documents to a trusted contact at a legal watchdog site, which quietly published a redacted version, just enough to stir attention without violating Eli's anonymity. The backlash was immediate. By the next morning, the story had spread from niche legal forums to major news outlets. Shareholders began asking questions. The airline's stock dipped 4 points in a single trading window. A second anonymous whistleblower leaked that a complaint about Jarrett had been lost 6 months earlier. That complaint, also involving a racially charged incident, had never made it to HR review. Patterns were emerging, and people were watching. Damon spent most of the following day in meetings, his voice steady but his body weary. He fielded calls from Viridian Corps' board, some worried about his visibility, others offering cautious support. But it was the invitation from Capitol Hill that changed the tone. A staffer from the Congressional Subcommittee on Travel Safety reached out directly, asking Damon to speak at an upcoming hearing. "Your story's not just compelling," the man said over the phone. "It's necessary." Damon accepted. He prepared carefully. Not just the facts, but the framing. This wasn't about personal grievance. It was about trust, power, and the subtle violence people endured quietly, high above the clouds. The hearing room was crowded, lined with camera crews and aides. Damon walked in wearing a navy suit, no tie, the small scar still visible near his lower lip. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "They didn't just serve me a drink," Damon told the room, his hands folded calmly on the table. "They served me a message, that silence would be easier than the truth, but I didn't choose easy." Applause wasn't allowed, but a few staffers nodded, and a congressman leaned forward, clearly moved, but with visibility came danger. The first threat arrived that night. An unmarked envelope appeared at Viridian Corps' downtown headquarters, slipped under the reception door after hours. Inside was a photo of Damon exiting his office, dated and time-stamped. No note, just the image. The implication hung in the air like smoke. 2 days later, Keon received a phone call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was calm, rehearsed. "You don't know what you're digging into. Back off." He recorded the call, then forwarded it to the FBI. Still, it escalated. Personal information about Keon, Lionel, and even members of Damon's staff began appearing on obscure message boards. Their addresses, email accounts, even partial phone numbers. It was clear someone had launched a doxing campaign. The intent wasn't just to scare them, it was to exhaust them. Damon stood firm. He personally met with Lionel and Keon at the Viridian headquarters the next day in a secured conference room lined with frosted windows. "I need you both to know something," he began, eyes locked on each of them. "If either of you want to step back, I'll understand. This isn't about martyrdom." Keon leaned forward, shaking his head. "I didn't sign up to be quiet. And Lionel's got enough fire in him to light up a courtroom." Lionel smiled faintly, though the stress lines on his face had deepened. "We've come too far to let one mug define the story." Damon looked out the window. The city stretched before them, bathed in autumn haze. He felt the weight pressing in, the pressure to retreat, to let the system absorb this as it always had, but something deep in his chest pushed back. They wanted this to be about one coffee cup, but it was about every unseen hand that ever poured it. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the chemist stepped into the witness box, a plain man in a gray suit with thin spectacles and a calm, measured tone. Damon kept his eyes forward, his posture unshaken, his jaw tight. The air inside the chamber felt stiff, like the room itself was holding its breath. "My name is Dr. Leon Hemsworth," the chemist began, adjusting his glasses. "I oversee materials testing and environmental safety at Viridian Corps." The lead attorney for Damon's team, Keon Mays, paced slowly in front of the jury box, holding a digital tablet with gloved hands. "Dr. Hemsworth, can you tell the court what you found on the coffee mug Mr. Carver drank from during his flight with Orbis Airlines?" "Yes," the chemist answered, his tone professional but tense. "Upon receiving a sample swab from the interior surface of the mug, I conducted a full chemical analysis. The results showed residue from an industrial-grade detergent, specifically a compound containing potassium hydroxide and butoxyethanol." Keon's eyes narrowed. "And is that safe for ingestion?" Dr. Hemsworth shook his head once. "Not at all. Those compounds are used to strip grease from engine parts, not for food-grade dishware. Even in trace amounts, they can cause oral irritation, tissue damage, and, in some cases, internal bleeding if swallowed." A murmur stirred in the audience. The judge banged his gavel gently. "Order," he said, his voice flat but firm. Damon's eyes didn't leave the chemist. His mind flashed back to the moment in the cabin when he had first tasted that strange bitterness. The sharp sting that followed, the napkin blotched with blood. His fingers curled around the edge of the table. This wasn't just validation, it was confirmation. Keon stepped forward again. "Was there anything unusual about the mug itself?" Dr. Hemsworth nodded. "Yes. The mug Mr. Carver drank from was not part of the airline's standard serving set. It lacked branding, serial inventory markings, and, based on the materials, it was not manufactured with food safety in mind. It appeared deliberately selected." That last word landed like a hammer. Across the courtroom, the airline's defense attorney, a broad-shouldered man named Russell Gentry, stood abruptly. "Objection. Speculation." The judge tilted his head. "Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's final remark." But the damage was done. The implication hung in the air, thick and inescapable. Keon turned back to the jury, slowly walking the line. "Dr. Hemsworth, was this residue present when the mug arrived to your lab?" "Yes, However, we were informed that the mug was returned to airline custody shortly after landing. It was discarded not long after." A pause. Keon tapped on his tablet and held it up. And yet, before that happened, Mr. Lionel Drax managed to capture these. He turned the screen toward the courtroom. High-resolution photographs of the mug taken from multiple angles. In one, faint white residue curled along the rim. In another, a swipe test strip darkened with chemical reaction. A buzz filled the gallery again. Keon spoke clearly. "No further questions for this witness?" As Dr. Hemsworth stepped down, the tension barely had time to ease before Keon turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to call our next witness, Eli Rohn." The courtroom doors creaked open as a young man in a plain navy shirt and black slacks stepped through. He walked with deliberate steps, his face pale, jaw tight. Damon watched him carefully. He remembered the boy's shaky hands, the quiet apology in the aisle. Now, those same hands gripped the edge of the witness box. "Please state your name and occupation," Keon said gently. "Eli Rohn," the young man replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a flight attendant trainee." Or, "I was." "You were present on the flight with Mr. Carver?" "Yes." Keon took a slow breath. "Tell us what you saw." Eli glanced toward the gallery, then back down at his hands. I saw Mr. Boone, Jarrett, bring out a separate mug from the rear galley. He didn't use the tray setup we usually follow. He poured the coffee himself. When I asked why, he told me not to worry about it." "Did that strike you as unusual?" "Yes. He said something like, 'Just following protocol for people who think they're special.'" A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Damon didn't move, but his heart beat faster. He saw the struggle in Eli's eyes, the weight of truth pressing down like gravity. "Had you seen behavior like that before?" Keon asked. Eli hesitated. "Yes, not always with drinks, but he'd sometimes make offhand comments. Say certain passengers needed grounding. We were told not to question him. He'd been with the airline longer than any of us." "Were there other incidents?" Keon's voice lowered, inviting honesty. "Yes," Eli nodded. "There was one other time on a red-eye flight. He swapped a passenger's meal tray for one marked cleaned, but it had been returned by another guest. That man got sick. We were told to call it food allergies." Gasps now came openly from the gallery. The judge lifted his hand again, signaling quiet, but even he looked rattled. Keon leaned forward. "Why are you coming forward now?" Eli's voice cracked. "Because it wasn't just a mistake this time. I saw the blood. I saw Mr. Carver's face, and I saw how everyone looked away." He looked toward Damon, eyes heavy with guilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Damon gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Russell Gentry stood again, attempting cross-examination, but his questions fell flat. The jury no longer leaned away, they leaned in. The courtroom now belonged to the truth, and the defense knew it. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the judge gave a recess. The gallery buzzed like a hive as reporters scrambled outside. Damon remained seated, hands folded on the desk, eyes on the courtroom floor. Keon slid into the seat beside him. "They wanted to bury you," he murmured, "but now they're the ones being exhumed." Damon gave no smile, just a steady breath. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as security began escorting attendees out, but the moment, the shift, had already happened. The mug had been cleaned, but now the stain was spreading fast. The courtroom fell silent as the airline's lead attorney, Vincent Hale, adjusted his tie and approached the bench with a thick manila folder in hand. Without warning, he announced, "Your Honor, the defense wishes to submit new context regarding Mr. Carver's past professional behavior, specifically his reputation for aggressive ambition and media engagement." The words cut through the still air like a blade. Damon sat motionless, his jaw tightening as he sensed the pivot. This wasn't about proving innocence anymore. It was about deflection, about dragging him through the mud to confuse the jury. Keon Mays, seated beside him, didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes locked on the judge, already preparing to dismantle the attack. "Objection," Keon said coolly. "Irrelevant character assassination under the guise of context. This is a trial about in-flight misconduct and deliberate endangerment, not personality speculation." The judge, a stern man named Caldwell Reeves, leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "I'll allow a limited inquiry," he ruled, "but tread carefully, counselor. This isn't a soapbox for conjecture." Vincent nodded, feigning humility, then turned toward the jury. "Mr. Carver is indeed a successful businessman, but he's also no stranger to the spotlight. In fact, over the past 2 years, he's granted more interviews than most CEOs in his sector combined. His public relations team has frequently amplified minor incidents for gain. Could it be that this event, unfortunate as it may be, is being escalated for similar reasons?" Damon's stomach turned. It wasn't just the insinuation, it was the casual cruelty of suggesting he had fabricated the trauma still aching in his mouth, in his memory. Around him, the jurors sat stiff, their faces unreadable. Keon stood slowly, lifting a small black tablet from his briefcase. "If the defense wants to discuss motives," he began, voice calm but icy, "then let's discuss theirs." He tapped the screen. "Exhibit 24C. Your Honor, this is a thread of internal emails obtained through discovery between the airline's HR director and public relations lead. Please follow the highlighted sections." A clerk quickly distributed printed copies to the jury and the bench. As the pages were flipped, the air grew thicker. "Read this line," Keon continued. "Begin a character assessment early. Find weak points in his business dealings. We need to get ahead of the narrative before this turns into a symbol case." A low murmur spread across the courtroom. Keon stepped closer, holding up the tablet now for the judge to see. This wasn't about facts. It was about manufacturing doubt. Before Damon Carver even stepped into this courtroom, the airline's strategy was to dig, not for truth, but for shadows. Vincent looked visibly shaken, his earlier confidence deflating. The judge narrowed his eyes at him but said nothing. The jury now leaned forward in their seats, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. Outside, the ripple effects were even greater. As word spread from reporters tweeting live updates, crowds that had gathered beyond the courthouse steps began to swell. Protesters held hand-painted signs that read, "Not just a sip, justice for Damon," and "Silence isn't service." Chanting broke out. News cameras panned over the growing movement, now fully ignited by the exposure of a premeditated smear campaign. Inside, Damon's mind spun, not from fear, but focus. He had stayed calm through blood, betrayal, and cover-up. But this was vindication beginning to bloom. As court recessed for the afternoon, Keon pulled Damon aside. "That wasn't just a win, that was a wedge. We fractured their foundation. You saw the jury's faces." Damon nodded, his lips still sore but curved faintly. "They tried to make this about me. Now it's about them." As they gathered their files, the courtroom door opened and another man entered, unannounced, uninvited. He was older, with gray stubble and a Navy maintenance badge still clipped to his belt. A court officer stepped forward, but the man held up his hands. "I was told to come straight here," he said. "My name's Colin Braddock. I used to be a security supervisor at the airline. I got something to say." Everyone froze. Keon turned slowly. "You worked with flight operations?" 15 years, Braddock replied, "and I saw reports get tossed. 5 different times. Same tactic, wrong mug, passenger complaint, no follow-up, each one accidentally scrubbed. Thought it was just a sloppy policy, until I saw the news." Keon's eyes lit up with something between fire and purpose. "Will you testify under oath?" Braddock nodded. "I can't ignore it anymore." Damon inhaled deeply. A new door had just opened, one not built by legal strategy but by conscience. As they exited the courtroom, the chants outside roared louder. One man with a bullhorn yelled, "They thought it was a one-time mistake, but this was a pattern." Another followed. Damon stood up so others don't fall. The tide was turning. Inside the judge's chambers, paperwork was already being prepared to admit Braddock's statement into the next day's hearing. The trial had shifted from defense to exposure, from managing fallout to pulling apart a system's quiet rot. That evening, as Damon sat by the window of his hotel suite, watching the courthouse glow under the floodlights of national media, his phone buzzed. It was Keon. Just 2 words. They blinked. Damon stared at the screen, eyes narrowing in recognition of what that meant. The airline's lawyers had finally lost control of the narrative. No more spin, no more whispers. Downstairs, journalists called it the most dramatic turn yet. Up on the 14th floor, Damon quietly sipped warm herbal tea, his throat still healing, but his voice stronger than ever. The airline thought this trial was damage control, but it was about to become an autopsy. The jury returned faster than anyone had expected. 3 hours. That was all it took. As the courtroom door swung open and the foreman rose with the folded slip in hand, the air inside thickened. Damon sat motionless at the plaintiff's table, his fingers interlocked tightly on his lap. Every whisper in the gallery vanished. The judge leaned forward slightly, brows drawn with interest. Keon sat to Damon's left, lips pressed into a straight line, his eyes locked on the jury like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew but still feared to hear. "We, the jury, find the defendant liable on all counts," the foreman said clearly, his voice firm, reverberating off the courtroom walls. "Negligence, willful endangerment, discriminatory conduct." The words landed with a weight that could not be ignored. A sharp gasp came from the gallery, followed by a wave of murmurs. The airline's lead attorney closed his folder, his expression unreadable. At the defense table, the corporate liaison dropped his pen. Damon exhaled slowly, not in relief, but with the grave realization that something enormous had just shifted. The judge, a stern man with gray at his temples and a deep baritone, nodded once. "This court awards compensatory and punitive damages in the amount of—" he named the figure. The courtroom gasped again, louder this time. The number was staggering. It surpassed the quiet settlement offer by millions, a sum large enough to buy silence 10 times over. But Damon didn't even flinch. His gaze remained steady, calm. He stood only when the judge asked if he had anything to say before the court adjourned. "I do," Damon replied. He stepped forward, his voice even but laced with quiet fire. "Your Honor, I respectfully decline the full award." A wave of confusion swept through the room. "I accept responsibility for costs and damages," Damon continued, "but I ask that this court instead issue a mandate, not just for money, but for change. I ask for third-party oversight of all crew conduct, randomized audits of crew behavior, and a transparent public database of passenger complaints that can no longer be swept under the rug." The judge blinked slowly, considering. Even the defense team seemed stunned by the proposal. Damon turned slightly toward the jury and gallery. This case was never about one moment, not about one cup of coffee. It was about the quiet systems that let harm hide in plain sight. The judge tapped his gavel softly. Request considered and approved. The tension broke like a dam giving way. Outside the courtroom, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered behind the barricades. Advocates, journalists, and supporters alike surged forward as news spread. Placards were hoisted above heads. Reporters shouted questions. Security held the crowd back, barely managing to contain the energy. Jarrett Boone, the disgraced flight attendant at the center of it all, was terminated from his position that same hour. A formal ban followed, barring him from working in any capacity within commercial aviation again. His name would be flagged in every background system tied to the National Aviation Database. Meanwhile, Eli Rohn, the quiet, anxious trainee who had spoken up despite the risk, was granted full federal whistleblower protection. His statement had been instrumental. It cracked the door wide enough for truth to pour through. Lionel Drax, the former internal observer who had risked his job to share that flash drive, was offered a new role, senior compliance officer on the newly approved oversight board. He accepted without hesitation. Later that evening, with the sun casting a soft orange glow through the courthouse windows, Damon stepped up to the cluster of microphones outside. He wore no tie, no flashy badge, just the quiet resolve of a man who had carried something heavy and now set it down. Cameras rolled, reporters waited. Damon cleared his throat. His voice was tired but unwavering. "This wasn't a story about coffee," he said. "It was a story about control and who gets to hold the cup without fear." The final verdict didn't just land, it hit like thunder. Damon Carver stepped out of the black sedan and looked up at the modest yet sharp-edged glass building that housed the newly formed Airline Oversight Council. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the city skyline behind him shimmered with a soft haze. He adjusted the knot of his navy tie and took a breath, not to calm nerves, but to ground himself. This was not a public appearance. There were no cameras, no press, just purpose. A security officer at the door recognized him instantly and gave a respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Carver. Welcome back." "Thank you," Damon replied quietly, his voice steady. He walked in without fanfare, the automatic doors closing behind him with a gentle hiss. Inside, the space was open and modern, filled with the low hum of conversation, keyboards tapping, and the occasional ring of a phone. On a nearby wall, a digital display flashed recent audit summaries and complaint tracking reports in real time. The council wasn't just symbolic, it worked, and Damon needed to see it for himself. He was greeted by Leonard Voss, the appointed operational director of the council. A wiry, sharp-eyed man in his early 50s, Leonard had been brought in from a civilian oversight group known for cleaning up corrupted transit agencies. He extended a hand. "Chairman Carver," he said with a hint of admiration, "glad you could come. The reforms you pushed for, some are already making waves." Damon shook his hand, his grip firm. "That's good to hear, but I'm not here to celebrate. I'm here to make sure this momentum doesn't fade." Leonard led him through a glass corridor that overlooked several operational pods. Young analysts combed through data, watching for patterns, flagged crew behavior, passenger incident spikes, internal chat audits. On one screen, a red icon pulsed next to a regional flight. A beverage cart complaint was being reviewed in real time. "We've installed monitoring protocols on every prep station for first class and diplomatic rows," Leonard explained, gesturing toward a video feed showing a crew member placing drinks on a tray. "All high-risk flights now require a pre-shift report and random compliance checks. And we've started interviewing passengers who opted into follow-up surveys. Transparency's up. Retaliation's down." Damon nodded slowly, watching a clip of a crew member glancing over a checklist with deliberate care. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Later that afternoon, Damon took a short walk to the Summit Center across the street to deliver a keynote at the Global Travel Ethics Conference. He didn't bring slides, no script, just a small index card with 4 words scribbled on it: stories, systems, silence, spill. The auditorium was packed. Travel regulators, aviation executives, policy reformers, all seated with notepads in their laps. The room quieted as Damon took the stage. He stood alone at the podium, letting the silence hang for a few seconds. "When I boarded that flight last year," he began, his voice even and clear, "I didn't know that the coffee I requested would become a symbol. I just wanted to stay awake, to prep for a meeting. Instead, I bled." He paused, scanning the crowd. No one shifted in their seat. "It wasn't just about me. What happened to me had happened to others. Men whose names you don't know. Men who didn't have the platform to speak, or who feared the consequences of doing so. Some of them came forward afterward, quietly, shamefully, as if they had done something wrong." He spoke of Lionel, of Eli, without naming them, protecting their identities but lifting their courage. He spoke of the chat logs, the systematic deflection of complaints, the bias hidden in the banal. He didn't rage, he didn't accuse, he simply spoke the truth, layer by layer, until the silence in the room grew heavy with realization. Outside, a drizzle began tapping the tall windows of the summit hall. Inside, Damon leaned into the mic for his final line, his gaze calm and unwavering. "They served bitterness to silence me, but now we're all done swallowing it." From one poisoned cup, a river of change had begun to flow. On a crisp morning, a full year after the ordeal, Damon Carver stood quietly at the gate of Lenox City Airport, his posture calm yet purposeful. The crowd around him buzzed with the usual pre-flight chatter, passengers shuffling with carry-ons, flight announcements crackling softly over the PA system, but Damon's mind was steady, focused on the moment ahead. This flight was unlike any he had taken before. It was the first since the incident that had marked his life, the flight that had changed everything. He didn't feel nervous or angry anymore. Instead, there was a quiet strength in his demeanor, a resolute confidence forged through months of struggle, legal battles, and hard-won victories. As the boarding call echoed, Damon adjusted his coat and stepped forward, blending in seamlessly with the others. The airport lights cast a soft glow across the polished floors, reflecting the bustling energy of travelers eager to begin their journeys. At the entrance to the jet bridge, a new flight attendant greeted him, a young man with a neat uniform and a gentle, respectful smile. His eyes held no trace of the cold indifference Damon had once faced. This attendant approached with deliberate care, holding a small tray. Without a word, he handed Damon a fresh cup of coffee. Unlike the plain, unmarked mug from that dark day, this one was a clear-labeled vessel, sealed with a printed strip and marked with a crisp QR code. Damon's fingers wrapped around the warm cup, feeling the reassuring heat seep through. The attendant's voice was soft but steady as he said, Your trust matters to us now, sir. Damon looked up, meeting the attendant's gaze. There was no malice here, only professionalism and the beginning of accountability. Damon offered a genuine smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far things had come. "Thank you," he replied calmly, the words carrying the weight of a man who had endured much but refused to be broken. As he stepped onto the plane and made his way to his seat, Damon's eyes roamed over the cabin. Around him, passengers of all ages and backgrounds settled into their seats. Black men and women, white travelers, tired fathers gently calming their restless children, curious teenagers whispering excitedly about their destinations. None of them knew the battles fought behind the scenes to ensure this flight would be different, safer, fairer. Damon's thoughts drifted to the long road he had traveled. The bloodied mouth, the sharp pain, the quiet betrayals and whispered threats, all had carved deep scars. Yet here he was, a year later, physically healed but carrying a resolve stronger than ever. This moment was not just about a cup of coffee. It was about reclaiming dignity, about standing firm against injustice. The engines hummed to life, and the cabin lights dimmed gently, cocooning the passengers in a warm glow. Damon settled back into his seat, closing his eyes briefly to steady his breath. His fingers tightened slightly around the cup. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled his senses, grounding him in the present. He took a slow sip, allowing the warm liquid to wash over his tongue. The taste was smooth, familiar, and untainted. Damon opened his eyes and glanced once more at the other travelers, imagining the countless unseen struggles each one might carry. He thought of the courage required to face adversity, to fight for respect in spaces that had too often denied it. Leaning back, Damon exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and quiet pride washing over him. The pain of the past had forged a new path forward, one paved with accountability and hope. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, he whispered to himself with measured conviction, "This time, the coffee tastes just right." The words hung in the air, a testament to a journey from harm to healing, from bitterness to dignity. What began with blood ended with dignity, and brewed a future no one could spit in again. He bled for dignity, and the truth bled through. If you stand for justice and protecting Black lives, subscribe now. Together, we fight back. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights the insidious nature of racial hostility, poisonings, literal or symbolic, and the dehumanization faced by Black individuals. This narrative is meant to raise awareness, provoke outrage, and inspire urgent action against racism and abuse of power.